global perspective, the history of neoliberalization can, and indeed should, be told as a history of dispossession. Wherever it has travelled, neoliberalism has meant that local populations and communities have been dispossessed of their land, their labour, their dignity, and sometimes even their very lives. As is becoming ever clearer, neoliberalism exposes not just individuals, but entire populations to premature death. Although it should be added that this exposure is not an even one, but is more immediately and intensely felt in the global south, and, additionally, is unevenly experienced along lines of race, class, gender, and disability. Lara Montesinos Coleman understands this very well. In her very important book, Struggles for the Human, which we're here to launch, she sets out to theorise neoliberalism as a form of necroeconomics, which is to say a project that, for its rollout and its consolidation, required and continues to require the routine killing of individuals and groups it has designated as barriers to capital accumulation. We might say, with a nod to Karl Marx, that neoliberal politics comes dripping from head to foot with blood and dirt. Lara's focus is centrally on the role played within this necroeconomic project by law, and more specifically, human rights. The central argument, which she makes very persuasively, is that law, far from being a neutral arbiter or moral bedrock, occupies a much more ambivalent role vis-à-vis neoliberalization. In a country like Colombia, from which she draws her examples, the rollout of neoliberalism was very often, indeed on a systematic basis, aided by the law. Here, law and human rights discourse has routinely been talked by corporate actors and neoliberal politicians into covering up, aiding, or even facilitating the dispossession, frequently onto destitution or death, of indigenous people, workers, and communities, sometimes functioning to facilitate extreme paramilitary violence, and at other times as a means of constitutionally diminishing workers' rights and labour unions. In Colombia, law has frequently served as a tool of neoliberal class warfare. And in such a context, the lazy liberal idea that human rights are there to protect us all very rapidly crumbles to dust. As Lara emphatically argues, however, it would be equally lazy to just completely give up on human rights, to cede this ground to the neoliberals or to capital. As she says in the conclusion to the book, I believe channeling Michel Foucault, we should reject the blackmail of the demand that we decide for or against human rights. Instead, she calls upon us to approach human rights as a terrain of struggle, a set of tools that can be used for the purposes of discipline as well as resistance, statecraft as well as critique, dispossession as well as solidarity. Through case studies and Lara's personal experience in Colombia, the book shows the sometimes incredible work that human rights discourse can do. For those of you who don't know us, the Independent Social Research Foundation is a small independent research funder. We know Lara because she received a one-year fellowship from us some years ago, and it's out of that fellowship that this brilliant book has come. One of the principles to which the ISRF is expressly committed is the idea that scholarship should have real-world relevance. And if you're wondering what real-world relevance looks like, I would say read this book. Lara's work is a shining example of research that doesn't just speak to lived experience, but that is also firmly and emphatically rooted in it. Throughout the book, she consistently draws upon the struggles, experiences, and theorizing of Colombian comrades she's worked with for more than a dozen years. The ideas and concepts she puts to work come out of their struggle, in which she has shared, and have also been forged on the anvil of neoliberalization. Even so, this is not primarily a book about Colombia or its history. Although it draws upon and speaks through that context, the book engages in ambitious theory building and ultimately contains lessons of broader relevance. This is nowhere clearer than in Lara's discussion in Chapter 4 of the concept of genocide. She shows that in the past, Colombian campaign groups have successfully challenged received definitions of genocide in their struggle against corporate violence, and in doing so, helped to set new legal precedent. With one eye on the ongoing devastation of Gaza, we cannot afford to underestimate the value of such interventions. Lara, this book is a really great achievement and I congratulate you on it. I'm now going to introduce you a little bit more formally and then I'll hand over to you. So Lara Coleman is Reader in International Relations, Law and Development at the University of Sussex, where she is also the Director of the Centre for Global Political Economy. She's been at Sussex since 2012, and before that she worked at Durham University. As readers of her book will know, she has a long history of human rights work in Colombia, where she worked with a network of peasant, trade union and indigenous organisations. Lara has published widely on themes of human rights, colonialism and decolonization, scholar activism and neoliberalism. Among her publications are an edited volume entitled Situating Global Resistance, which came out in 2012, and a number of brilliant papers on themes that are very relevant to tonight's discussion. One of these was carries the great title, The Making of Docile Dissent, Neoliberalization and Resistance in Colombia and Beyond. I'm sure will be of interest to many of you here today. Lara, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. Over to you.
Great. Thanks very much. Anyway, thank you so much, Lars, for the introduction, and Lars and Stuart and Despina for organising this on behalf of the ISRF. And also to Aicha and David for your comments. I hope, thank you for your comments. So, as Lars was saying, so the book, it's Struggles for the Human, Violent Legality and the Politics of Rights, is trying to interrogate the politics of human rights in struggles against capitalism and colonialism, neocolonialism. Now, some of you will be very familiar with the criticisms of human rights. So that human rights, as a discourse of struggle, aren't getting at the root causes of dispossession and oppression, that they're inherently complicit with capitalism, colonialism, or an ideology of neutral rule of law. And this is the kind of violent legality part of the title. So, you know, you might say, well, oh, surely law hasn't got tools for protecting people. Yeah, but also the law is what underpins much exploitation, the plunder of resources, ecological devastation, which happen not just, you know, despite law, but often in many cases because of it. And at the same time, the way in which harm and responsibility are constructed legally is very much so as to kind of disappear responsibility. That's a phrase from Scott Veatch. So that only the individual who pulled the trigger effectively is held liable, or the corporation is designed in such a way so as to shield the beneficiaries from corporate atrocities from liability. And then relatedly, the other major critique of human rights, and this is the Struggles for the Human bit, is that human rights are said to naturalize a concept of the human that's sovereign, self-interested, ruling over nature, that's been shaped historically through the degradation and exploitation and dehumanization of colonized peoples. But at the same time, as a human rights, something we can't not want. And I know, you know, a number of us have been, you know, following very closely the ICJ ruling on Gaza. You know, it's just a really important illustration, as Lars was saying, about, you know, the extent to which human rights and international law can be incredibly important tools of struggle. But then the question arises, you know, how and in what way is it possible to appeal to human rights without foreclosing on other possibilities, on forms of political economy that might be more enabling of human and non-human flourishing, even in the face of the climate crisis, even of our collective survival. So what the book is trying to do is to take a fresh approach to this set of questions. It's kind of an ethnographically informed blend of political philosophy and critical theory that comes out, as Lars was saying, through many years of engagement with a network of peasant, worker and indigenous movements in Colombia. This comes from my pre-academic life. I was involved in a network that was set up on a principle of horizontal relations between peoples to build international solidarity. But fundamentally, this isn't a book about Colombia. It's very much a political inquiry into human rights as a vocabulary of resistance, but also an ethical inquiry. So into thinking about human possibilities and political imaginations in the face of atrocity and devastation. But what's most distinctive about it, I think, is that it's trying to put struggles against capitalist extraction at the forefront of ethical and political reflection. And so, as a result, the book ends up telling a very different story, both from those who uncritically embrace human rights and from critics who reject human rights outright. And I argue that the very idea that we should decide for or against human rights is actually something that only makes sense when we bypass the politics of struggle. So There's two sort of main contributions of the book. The first one is a diagnosis of what I call a predominant approach to human rights at this juncture, particularly since the rise of neoliberalism. And so I argue that when human rights are yoked to existing structures of power, it's not because they're inextricably tied to liberal individualism. It's not because they inherently inculcate docile forms of subjectivity, which is what many critics have argued, but because of the ways in which they're taken up as abstract values, which then can be fixed very neatly within an existing order of things. So that human rights can very easily become add-ons to a vision of rule of law that defines very much international economic law that was designed by, particularly by lawyers at the GATT, who are followers of Friedrich Hayek. It was very much designed to facilitate plunder. And I look at this in the book through corporate social responsibility for human rights and also trade union, global union federations' attempts to form global agreements of corporations. And what I argue is that this scenario effectively represents the privatization of human rights. And it's inseparable from a prevailing approach to ethics, which I call a sort of feel-good ethics, which is based on a fetishization of abstract values. So it's got to be ethical. If you're promoting human rights, if you're promoting positive initiatives, this is ethical, this is liberatory in some sense. And I say, well, this actually rests upon a suppression of what are known to be the consequences of capitalism, of the way in which ordinary law and economic policy condemn many to a predictable and untimely death. And I have a conversation in there, if any of you know Lauren Berlant's work on cruel optimism. So Berlant talks about cruel optimism as in terms of the harm that we end on doing to ourselves by continuing to hold on to fantasy, to hoard idealizing theories, Berlant talks about, in the face of the retraction of post-war social democracy. But talks about the idea of this an optimistic attachment is the idea that this thing, we hold on to this thing and it's going to make things better in just the right way. My focus of human rights is how often in much cosmopolitan intervention of NGOs, there are fantasies of ethical action on behalf of others that end up doing harm to the targets of intervention, impeding the aims of those who seek to act ethically in a very subtle and insidious way. And I call this pernicious optimism. And I call it pernicious because there's a desire to affirm the potential for the present to be made ethical that takes the form of a fantasy that blocks out the possibility of addressing the relationship between the ethical intervention and the harm that can be perpetuated through it. But then the other aspect of the book is to say that this is really not the full story. And there's been a lot of discussion of the ability of human rights to sort of appropriate everything into a discourse of rights. What's really important in the book is actually to try and challenge the idea that, radical political struggles so easily get translated into this depoliticizing language of rights. And to think about, not just how political struggle is assimilated back into a language of rights, but how also they can make rights other than themselves, other than they're normally understood. And so, part of the argument is about the role of law and strategic litigation. So despite the violent legality thing, I'm very much not against law per se. I argue that law, as it's mobilised within the struggles of social movements, can be a very important site of critique. And there's nothing actually about the legal form that requires that the legal subject is this free, rational individual of capitalism. There was actually a lot of jurisprudential and philosophical arguments went into constructing law in that way. And also, legal change and undoing legal architectures that facilitate plunder is really important for changing social relations. So what I look at in the book is the power of moments of rupture in campaigns surrounding strategic litigation, but also in alternative justice mechanisms in which dominant legal narratives are subverted. The main alternative justice mechanism I've been involved in Colombia is the People's Permanent Tribunal, which was an unofficial international court that came out of the Russell tribunals into Vietnam. And what I look at is the way in which some of the arguments made there and some of the rulings function as a form of immanent critique. So really pushing legal concepts and categories beyond what can be contained within the order of capital and its economy of representation, undermining a very selective recognition of the human, whether as an individual victim or as a rational actor, perpetrator of abuse. So, for example, one of the things that Lars was talking about is actually, one of the rulings of the tribunal actually condemning corporate involvement in crimes against humanity and genocide through a reworking of dominant understandings of genocidal intent, to then say that this is an indictment of the entire neoliberal model that's promoted by international financial institutions and the WTO. And I talk about this as sort of counter-legalities, so using theoretically cogent legal arguments to reveal the impossibility of remedy within the existing order, but also at the same time. So I'm going to start coughing again. I've had this awful flu thing, and now better. Once I start coughing, I won't stop. It'll be the talk over. So, and even though these rulings, right, they wouldn't be it's incredibly unlikely that they'd be accepted by a court. I mean, just look at the ICJ case, and it's absolutely incredible that, what I would say is a pretty textbook case of genocide is being recognised. These sorts of counter-legalities can be really important pedagogical tools to social movement struggle. And some of you who know about Colombia know that there's currently a left-wing government that's been elected. I don't think without these kind of this critical use of law in this way, we'd actually be at a point where that had happened, because it's been so important to building social movement, building pedagogy. And then I also, beyond the legal side of things, tie this very closely to a series of struggles that I've been quite closely linked to across the Colombian countryside that are quite explicitly in pursuit of other ways of being human from the idea of the human that's normally enshrined within human rights. So these are struggles called planes de vida, plans of or for life, where peasant, indigenous, black communities have tried to reclaim territory or defend their right to live on the land and build forms of life that are less predatory upon other humans and upon nature. And something that's really important within that process is the idea that, sometimes quite explicitly, that the vision of life that we want to build in this process has to be something that comes out of an immanent critique of development discourse and of human rights. So even though these movements are using human rights always as a party in conflict with the state, to hold the state to account for genocidal development policies, but also actively seeking to redescribe what it is to be human in relationship with one another, away from this sovereign and self-interested individual. And these struggles draw on a variety of traditions, including liberationist Christianity, but particularly the idea of buen vivir, which is a concept that comes from indigenous cosmovisions of the Andes, that means living well together. Often gets, again, something that often gets fetishized in a lot of conversations these days around indigenous peoples, but something these movements emphasizes, this isn't, buen vivir is not a finished category. It's a horizon of desire. It's an ethical and spiritual code of conduct. It's a way of constructing what it means to be human. And so I finished the book with some comments about ethics. And I argue that, well, if the vision of man, of the human, traditionally deemed to ground human rights, is actually not only contingent and particular, but also historically indissociable from exploitation, expropriation, and other forms of systemic violence, this question then arises, well, are we just left with relativism? Can we appeal to anything beyond a specific cultural formulations of ethics and associated understandings of humanity and struggle? And what I argue, and I'm just going to sort of map this very, very briefly, but is that the sense of good to which these struggles appeal isn't something that's rooted in inherent human dignity or in qualities of the human already preconceived as morally valuable within a very modern colonial economy of knowledge. But I start to map out the idea of an insurgent humanism, that's being shaped within these struggles that gives a different basis of authority to human rights, in which there is a back and forth between a critique of dehumanizing power relations and a sense of good or of goodness that has no vocation to be caught directly within language, but is known firstly through sensitivity to the effects of power and violence, and secondly through, and I draw on this Iris Murdoch's moral philosophy, but through a loving, contemplative attention to the world.
So starting with David White, he's a professor of climate justice here at Queen Mary University of London. He joined Queen Mary in 2022 from the University of Liverpool, where I understand he still lives. He directs the Centre for Climate Crime and Climate Justice here at Queen Mary as well. David's research explores the relation between law and corporate power from a number of different perspectives, including human rights, working conditions, and ecocide. His current research focuses on legal responses to climate change and, more specifically, corporate accountability for climate change. I don't think I need to tell anybody here that David has published a great deal, and among his most fascinating books are The Corporate Criminal, Why Corporations Must Be Abolished, published in 2015, The Violence of Austerity, published in 2017, and most recently, Ecocide, Kill the Corporation Before It Kills Us. David, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you, Lars, and look, it's just a pleasure to be here and to talk about Lara's book, and I'm going to obviously start by saying a few words about that. I do think the book is beautiful. I don't just mean the cover, although I do tend sometimes to judge books by their cover. It's a beautiful cover, but it's a beautifully written book, and I think if I was summing it up, I would just say it's beautifully honest, because I think it's honest about law. I think it's honest about human rights. It rejects a dualistic, the Foucauldian thing that Lars introduced us to at the start. That you have to be blackmailed into choosing whether to support law, be for law, against law, for rights, or against rights. And I think it's very honest about that in the question it asks. Liberalism clearly has run its course. I mean, the liberalism, and by that I just mean that no liberal claims to equality in this world can stand up now after Gaza. That's not, and after what we're witnessing right now in Rafah, there's no question that we can think about a world, in which basic kind of fundamental tenets of the order could ever be thought of as being equal. And I'll just say that in broad terms. If we maybe get into the discussion, we can kind of pin that down. But this is not a world in which liberalism can have any credibility. I think that's been the case for a long time, but now we know this is absolutely beyond any kind of discussion, I think. So, what do we say about human rights in a world in which liberalism has run its course? I'm just quoting from the back of the book. That's not my words. That's the key question that this book asks, and I think it's an honest question that we all have to stand up and ask, and in a world where human rights have been, as Lars says, privatized, or in a kind of neoliberal world where we cannot think about rights unless we think about the ways in which organizations whose lifeblood is to profit from us, we are dependent upon them to uphold rights. So what does that mean in terms of rights? When we, and I agree to some extent, I might differ in terms of degrees or in particular situations, but I definitely agree it's a tactical question whether we engage with law or not. So we can't, the law is here. We can't just ignore it, right? It's not something, as a fundamental power structure which I think reflects basic social relationships. We can't ignore it, right? Of course we can. Like, maybe I can. I'm a professor in a posh university. Maybe I can ignore it, right? But most people in the world can't ignore the fact that there are legal tools that maybe can be tactically useful and maybe not under certain circumstances. So I just think that idea that, yes, of course, human rights are inherently tied to capitalism, liberalism, colonialism, of course. But that doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't ask, how do we use law with our eyes fully open? I think that's the way that's the question I think that this book really honestly kind of poses. Sometimes we're talking about things that are tactically useful, sometimes not. Always, and I think this is the important thing. And the other thing, when I say the book is beautifully written, I think it's also beautifully written in a way that it doesn't try to get to a clear conclusion, right? Even the conclusion is almost like, I think the 7 point, is it, how many points were at the end? 10 points. The 10 points. It's actually, there's only a couple of those points that seem to be conclusive, and I think that's really important and really appropriate that you use the book to then springboard into other questions. And I think I'll kind of leave that to you, because I've only got 5 minutes. I've probably used up 4, and I do want to just say a couple of things, really rich things that came out of the book, like empirical things that I want to kind of pick up on. And one is relating to, I mean, look, so there are a number of struggles. You talked about the Permanent Appeals Tribunal, which of course brings together a lot of the struggles that Lara's worked on, but I think there are two really strong themes for me, specific struggles that are really important because they involve people that you know, and people who've, you know, the mother of the trade unionist, the Coca-Cola trade unionist who was assassinated, sorry, the BP trade unionist who was assassinated, but you are also in touch with the friends and families and colleagues of Coca-Cola trade unionists that have been assassinated. Those stories, BP in Casanare and the struggles around the Coca-Cola plants, I think are very important for the first half of the book, maybe kind of ways of really thinking what this means in a really grounded sense, what it means to struggle around rights. And I tell you what, I didn't realise that John Ruggie, people might or might not know who John Ruggie is. If you're into this corporate human rights, how you know the international organisations, the UN Human Rights Council, has responded to violations of violations of human rights by corporations, you would know who John Ruggie is. He's a kind of liberal political scientist who suddenly became the most important person in all of this and established a set of Ruggie principles, which are largely voluntary principles. And there's a really interesting struggle at some point that Lara brings out a little bit in the book between a kind of resurgent, let's say, a kind of resurgent global south third world movement in international law, which is pushing for binding standards, for a treaty which has binding standards on corporations, and this American political scientist who's appointed by Kofi Annan under, I think, very mysterious circumstances, but we'll leave it there. He presides over a process which pushes that out, and I do want to say this. Sorry, this is something that I've remembered and I've forgotten. I was in the UN Human Rights Council because I wrote about this. I was in the UN Human Rights process, the UN Human Rights Council in 2010. I know, I don't look that old, but I was doing all this research then. But we were in the gallery, me and my co-researcher, and Ruggie got his principles passed by the UN Human Rights Council, right? And he got those passed after a struggle, and actually countries like Ecuador, particularly South Africa, were speaking against it. And when they passed, when he got the majority, he strode into the middle of the floor of the UN Human Rights Council, and the American ambassador from the other side strode into the middle of the floor, and they hugged. They just hugged. And in a sense, that moment, Lara's kind of commentary about this, because Ruggie ends up in Colombia, meeting with BP, saying that what they've done, and it's I think it's a really important little kind of snippet that I hadn't been aware of, but saying that what they've been training the notorious 16th Brigade, the assassination squad that BP had such close links to, partly via their security, but also directly. And there had been a scandal that had grown up in the 90s that was the subject of a number of investigations. Ruggie goes and says, BP now are training the 16th Brigade, and he lauds them for training the 16th Brigade. And at the time of his visit, somebody is assassinated or disappeared by the 16th Brigade. So those kind of, and yet at what happens a couple of years later is that, led by Ecuador, a number of global south countries rebel, kick the Ruggie principles out. They haven't managed to get to a binding treaty. But sorry, that's a big, so what? They were hugging, yeah. So what? And then Ruggie has been to Colombia to legitimise state violence and in fact, the worst forms of collusion that's unfolded in this book. But it tells you about, I think, the contradictions and the contradictions that we need to kind of take account of, right? Because there was a rebellion in the UN Human Rights Council, and it was an important rebellion. And on the ground, for people who are organising against the likes of BP, it's important that the Ruggie principles were kicked out, because the cause lawyers who do come into for some criticism in this book can only be empowered to support local struggles if they're not going to be completely tied into those those processes which are ultimately not threatening for companies. So I think what the book does, that's one kind of example of where we can see, well, how do we measure human rights? And for me, and I think this is not what the book says, but what the important contribution of the book is how does law threaten power? How does it confront power in ways that are really meaningfully threatening power? And so often, of course, that's not the case, as the book shows. And I think that's probably the question I'll kind of leave on that one, because sometimes I agree. Human rights discourses, practices, especially when they are brought into other fora, as Lara says, can be very powerful. That's not me. That's not me. You don't have to take that from me. Just read the book.
Moving on to Aicha Tribukcu, who is an associate professor in human rights at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's also co-director of the research centre called LSE Human Rights. Before joining LSE, Aicha was a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute, and she also taught at Columbia University and Harvard University. In 2020, she was appointed as a senior fellow at the FUN Global Fellows Programme at Princeton University. Her research interests are in social, political and legal theory, with a focus on human rights, cosmopolitanism, political violence, internationalism, postcolonial studies and transnational social movements. Her work looks at the politics of transnational solidarity and at the entanglements of violence and human rights. In 2018, she published a book with the wonderful title, For the Love of Humanity, the World Tribunal on Iraq. Aicha, thank you very much for being with us this evening. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Lars. Thank you to ISRF for organizing the celebration of Lara's wonderful book. I think this book needs to be read by every human rights student, by every human rights scholar, and every political theorist. I would include anthropology in there, every anthropologist, every sociologist, whomever cares about the politics of rights, of human rights, radical political movements, and their vexed relation to legality and the discourse of rights must get their hands on this book as soon as possible. I felt like I knew Lara when I was reading the book. We're meeting for the second time, apparently. The first one was at my book launch at LSE. As life would have it, here we are together. But reading the book was as if I was talking to a close colleague and a comrade. And we've been reading the same things. We've been musing over the same paradoxes. And, it was a kind of comradely and collegial affinity that I haven't experienced in a long time. So I cannot recommend the book highly enough. I will not summarize it because, first of all, it's impossible in 5 minutes. And second of all, Lara and David have done a great job with that summary. What I do have to offer are 5 meta questions that I was provoked into thinking through, precisely because I'm as antidisciplinary as Lara is, and she also makes a case for antidisciplinarity, not merely transdisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity. This is the product of a great mind who is versed in multiple fields of study: legal, political, social theory, political philosophy. Everything is in here. I had to draw on all my training, antidisciplinary training, to appreciate the book. So, having said that, I have 5 questions that I very much hope we can discuss as a collective, but they're directed to Lara. She's responsible for having been so provocative. In my reading, I was interested in certain structural binaries that underwrite the argument of the book. They are the strength of the book, and at the same time, for me, those binary constructions were exactly where I said, well, is the difference between them so clear and so stark? One of the binaries that structures the book is that between politics on the one hand and ethics on the other. So Lara at some point defines ethics. This is an open question, perhaps you have something else in mind. She calls it the relation between politics and its outside. So I would like to ask, why call human rights a way to think about our ethical obligations to one another? Why not categorize the problem of our ethical, let's drop the word ethical, the problem of our obligations to one another? Why pose that as an ethical question rather than a straight up political question? What is at stake in such categorizations? Why do you think of human rights as an ethical question as opposed to political? And what consequences follow from that categorical distinction? So this question, I think, is rather important because Lara says the answer to the question why we fight is supposed to be an ethical answer rather than a political one. She also interprets human rights as the attachment to a deeper ethical call, or as the manifestation of a deep ethical call. So one wonders, what is this ethics? How is it different than politics? What would be at stake if we thought about the politics of human rights rather than the ethics of human rights? I also ask this question because you have a critique of Judith Butler and the ethical turn in political philosophy or philosophy more broadly. Number 2 is again a meta question about the book, which is called Struggles for the Human. I can pose that as a methodological problem. So the book is about, Lara tells us, struggles that seek to unsettle the concept of the human that has underpinned capitalist and colonial relations. Struggles that seek to unsettle the concept of the human that has underpinned capitalist and colonial relations. If so, is this how the radical activists and social movements you are writing about, is this how they themselves conceptualize what they were doing? You say sometimes explicitly the question of the human was at stake, but methodologically, what are the implications of inscribing a particular interpretation of a social movement's struggle, the stakes of it, on the social movements, especially in cases where they themselves don't think of their anti-capitalist struggles as a struggle for redefining the human or trying to imagine other ways of being human in the world. Sometimes you say quite explicitly they did so, sometimes they don't. So how did you tease out this internal logic? Don't get me wrong, I'm not against teasing out implicit logics in political action. Since Marx, that's been the task of, we don't tell the world, as Marx says, seize your struggles, here's the true watchworld of the struggle. We show the world why it actually struggles. And I very much appreciate this framing, but what were the challenges of inscribing this kind of struggle for the human where it did not exist, if it didn't exist? In most of the cases you describe, what are the ethics of such academic inscriptions? I ask this because Lara is also extremely critical of the tendency of the academy to fetishize, to appropriate, and to extract from social movements. So I'm asking her what kind of epistemic and otherwise methodological strategies she employed to not fall into the same trap. She acknowledges, for example, la red de humanidad, right?
Yeah.
See, do not, this network of movements she was working with for decades, by the way. Did I mention that this is political ethnography at its best? It infuses philosophy with ethnography, critical theory with social movement studies, exemplary work. Yet, if this movement did not itself think of its struggle as a decolonial struggle, as one embodying a decolonial ethos, then what is involved in describing their struggle as a decolonial struggle? As Lara makes clear, we're faced with a plurality of movements across Colombia that come together. Anarchist, communist, indigenous, decolonial, you name it. So what we're faced with is a network of pluralities. Why call it decolonial, say, as opposed to anarchist in their appreciation of horizontality? One could choose among very many different ways to conceptualize it. Again, the question is about ethics and politics of academic inscription onto social movements. So number 3, you make a binary distinction between pernicious optimism of global civil society, neoliberal understandings embedded within notions of global civil society, and you make an extremely convincing case drawing on Lauren Berlant's work on cruel optimism and show why this type of pernicious optimism contributes to the perpetuation of the forms of inequality and oppression and exploitation that we're facing. Pernicious optimism on the one hand, and what Lara calls radical hope on the other hand. What signs the difference between them? And I would like to be a radical, embodying radical hope, but I often suspect I'm falling into some type of cruel optimism. How were you so clear? How are these movements, again, practicing a form of radical hope rather than pernicious optimism or cruel optimism? Politics, ethics, I mentioned, pernicious optimism, radical hope, the immanent versus the transcendental. That would require another round table. I won't get there. But I was also struck by your characterization of what you call the fetishism of abstract values. And she diagnoses, I choose the word carefully because you have this beautiful discussion of what it means to diagnose a problem and how one can do it in problematic ways. But you diagnose part of the problem here as fetishism of abstract values And it made me wonder, on the other hand, where we are, in your account, dealing with radical social movements who also mobilize abstract values, such as buen vivir. That's an abstract thing too. Vida, life. And most of all, the good, what you conceptualize rather abstractly as the good. So again, what is the difference between these abstractions, the good, life, love, and other concepts that you beautifully propose? And how does one then not fall into the trap of fetishizing them? What's the difference between a fetish and a horizon of desire? That was 3. Number 4, this is the big one, and I am dealing with this myself, and I very much appreciate Lara taking a stance on this. She says we need some form of humanism. I myself am more agnostic about that asserted need, precisely because, as Lara demonstrates forcefully, building on Sylvia Winter and other scholars, how European colonial humanism has been implicated in and justifying colonial violence, capitalist exploitation, through the overrepresentation of European capitalist, bourgeois, individualist man as the essence of the human. So I get that. I get why humanism is problematic. What I'm not entirely convinced by is your proposal that it is necessary to have a new type of humanism, and I will call this insurgent humanism. So my question is, what exactly is the difference between this insurgent humanism, and how will that insurgent humanism avoid falling into the problematic aspects of humanism as such? And lastly, this is what I am quoted and as offering love as a basis for authority of human rights. That's where Lara quotes me as saying, the World Tribunal on Iraq, similar to the Permanent People's Tribunal that you were dealing with, ascribed, you say, the basis of authority, or even you say this is source of authority in love. Whereas I say, the love part, the love of humanity, was a response, not of the activists themselves, but this is me teasing out the logic. It was a response to the question, why care? I wasn't proposing that as a basis of authority for human rights. Neither is Murdoch proposing love as the basis of authority. But the primary question I have under number 5, and that's my last one, is why search for a basis at all? Why search for the grounds of what you call insurgent humanism or universality or human rights at all? Perhaps the very search for grounds, the very search for a basis of the struggle for the human is part of the problem, perhaps. Thank you.
These are big meta questions. You can't really have small ones, can you? Okay, so the first question, as I understood it, was about the distinction between politics and ethics. Why posing this as an ethical question rather than just as a political one?
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me that's it. Often when sort of radical theorists talk about politics, there's a sense that, if we talk about ethics, that's just moralism. That's kind of ethics within the terms of the existing order of things. But actually, I do think that, and I guess this will come back to this perhaps with this question of love and so on. But it's not so much that I think ethics is different from politics. And I actually think that ethics needs to be absolutely fundamental to how we think about politics and social movement organisation. But often I think the question, we stop too quickly and don't look at those bigger ethical questions. And I suppose, coming back to, I also wasn't trying to say love is a basis of authority, but more a disposition. But it comes back to these questions: why search for the basis of authority? And and you're saying, well, is the search for grounds part of the problem? I think, yes, it is. If on the basis of that search for grounds, you then start legislating for ethics and start saying or legislating for politics on that basis. So what I'm really trying to think about is, how can thinking about the grounds of ethics actually animate political struggle? Because I do think that very often these questions get left out. And then what you also get, and I guess this is another audience perhaps for the book, is the normative theorists who then do the ethics completely separately, who aren't engaging with the political struggle, who are then saying, well, here's this vision of the human, these are certain morally valuable qualities of the human from which we define human dignity, let's start from there and define lots of nice, ethical, cosmopolitan ideals which are actually immensely damaging. So then it does become really important to think about questions of, the basis of authority for human rights and where do they come from my perspective. This is also having a background, right, the sort of training in moral philosophy and sort of coming at these questions and thinking about them from that direction. But I do think it's important. And I think the real thing I'm trying to get at, rather than, I think love is important for understanding, for understanding goodness is important, but it's this back and forth between the political critique and this, contemplative, loving regard that Ira's word talks about, that I do think is very important. And then I think I'm going to go backwards through some of your... I swear there are 6 questions here, but anyway. So go backwards through this. Again, what I'm not... which way am I going to approach this? I'll go backwards. So this idea that I'm not so much saying that we need some form of humanism in a kind of prescriptive way.
I think you are.
Am I?
In the last conclusions, yeah.
Am I? Okay. It's more, if we're going to have humanism, we need to think, can we think about it differently based on what's happening within these struggles? I renounce it all if I do it. Say, you don't have to have it, in a sort of way that's all about, let's build a humanist project that looks like this.
Necessary to hold on to some sort of...
hold on to some sort of humanism, but in sense of holding on to it in relation to actually appreciating what's going on within these uses of human rights. So it's not saying, let's advance this big intellectual political project of humanism, but to say, there is a humanism here, and it's interesting and important, and it's not this Western humanism that has been so incredibly damaging to colonised peoples. But it's actually, there's a humanism in the making within these struggles and within the struggles of other social movements that I think is important. And it's also getting away from that relativism. And I guess it's something that, I'm so conscious of in the university, is just the extent to which, so many, so much interpretation of decolonial indigenous, struggles is all just this kind of relativistic, these are just these little local things happening on the ground. Almost approached in this kind of very colonial anthropological mindset, whilst at the same time held up as these sort of romanticised ideals. And so I do think that, that it's important to think about, well, actually, what's going on here? Actually, there's a reaching beyond to something far more universal about humanity within this. And then, jumping back a question. This question about, the methodological and ethical question about why, unsettling the concept of the human. How do I tease out this internal logic? And there's 2 aspects to this. So one is, this is literally what the conversations that have been happening. So this isn't that, I've read Sylvia Wynter and gone, oh, you need to have other concepts of the human. These are actually conversations happening on the ground. Including in some of the literature and pedagogical pamphlets that people have put together. So there is a very strong sense, one popular educator I talks about well, our convergence as a worker and peasant organisation, in convergence in space-time he talked about with indigenous peoples. Immediately we're having to challenge this concept of the human and actually having these conversations. So it isn't, on one level it's not, it's not something that's imposed, but on another level it is this question of your sort of bigger question of how do you tease out an internal logic, which I think very much links to. I think I just say even though they don't use the word decolonial, the ethos, the kind of the concepts there, and that's far more of a critique again of a lot of the decolonial fetishizing type literature, in the sense that, so for me, I was working with these movements, and then suddenly Valdomignolo and all these people writing in English suddenly are going, oh look, there's all this very important decolonial thought. Hang on a minute, no one's calling it this, and no one's doing this in a way that isn't, concretely tied to material struggles against capitalism, against colonialism. And I think I do talk about Silvia Rivera, because you can critique of this. And the idea that actually these even though people aren't using the word decolonial, the concepts that are present within Anglophone decolonial scholarship are absolutely part of these struggles. So that's really what I'm trying to draw attention to. But I think there is this, and it's something I've struggled with the whole time writing the book, is this: how do you tease out an internal logic? And I think it's a really, really difficult methodological question.
Yes.
And I don't know if I can answer it, except to say, so earlier on I talk about drinking in the presence of a voice recorder as a research method. Unfortunately, UKR have just changed their tools on their regulations on alcohol, so that's gone now. So potentially you're not allowed to buy it anymore. But it is having these sorts of conversations and chats with people is incredibly, just for kind of getting a sense of that internal logic. And I don't know how to. It's also, I'm a part of this ISRF research group on political affect. It's like, how do you actually analyse affect, and how do you analyse these really subtle things that are going on within a social movement? And a lot of it's been me just having a drink with someone going, we were talking about that in the meeting the other day, and what do you think about this? Because I'm kind of thinking about that, right? And it's not interviews, and it's very...
You have an amazing introduction and methodological discussion already. I was trying to pick your brains about it.
But I'm also, it's something I'd be really interested to hear from anyone else doing this thing from you. It's like, how does one do this? Because it is so difficult. And then finally, the pernicious optimism versus radical hope. I think there's always a danger between slipping between the two, right? Between falling back into fantasy. Where I'm talking about radical hope, whereas pernicious optimism, is attachment to fantasy, attachment to the idea, that this thing's going to change the world. Very much within the Planes de Vida, there's much more of a sense of, okay, we're living in a situation of atrocity, of devastation, of genocidal state and corporate policies against us. We've lost many of our comrades, and we're still holding on to the possibility of some kind of future good, and trying to work that out, not by just going, well, here's this big solution, here's this, this is what socialism looks like, this is what communism looks like. It's much more about how can we build something, often very tactically and strategically, but at the same time has this bigger horizon of desire, and trying, instead of saying, this is what buen vivir is, actually saying, so yes, it is abstract in a sense, but it's not abstract in the sense of a kind of fetishized concept that can just be added onto something. It's something that's more like a sort of regulative ideal. It's something trying to reach to, perhaps.
Wait till World Bank picks up on it.
Oh,
they could, just like sustainability, and that's why it's very important.
But it has been picked up. It's already been picked up in ways which are, immensely damaging. But I think what it is about this, the difference between the fantasy and the fetish and the, having some kind of, ethical horizon is precisely this thing of always working it out continuously in tension with that imminent critique of power and violence.
Brilliant.
I hope I've answered all your questions.
Brilliant.
I think I just have more questions.